Welcome to Linguistics Tube. On this channel, you will find videos about learning English, as well as more scientific videos about linguistics and psychology, and more general academic topics such as study skills, conducting research, and writing academic articles. This episode is part of my series which explores how to write effectively in English. We will learn about a range of skills which you can use generally, and I will also share my advice for specific writing exams, such as TEM-4 and IELTS. In this episode, we will learn about the process and skills involved in writing an argumentative essay. This video will help you if you are learning about argumentative essays for the first time, or if you are an experienced writer who wants some higher level advice. You can use the information in this video if you are preparing for an English exam, like IELTS and TEM-4, and need guidance on improving your argumentative writing. Before we discuss how to write an argumentative essay, we must firstly answer the most basic question. What is an argumentative essay? Well, there are three processes to construct an argumentative essay. The first process is for the writer to present his or her point of view, which is also called an opinion. After this, the next process is to support the point of view with arguments. The arguments are the reasons why the writer has that particular point of view. The final process is for the writer to support the arguments with evidence or examples. Therefore, the evidence supports the arguments, and the arguments support the viewpoint. Overall, the goal of an argumentative essay is to persuade the reader that the writer's point of view is a good point of view. In other words, the writer needs to convince the reader that he or she is correct. And we will learn how to put all of this together in this episode. Argumentative essays usually have three basic sections: the introduction, the body, and the conclusion. You can see that these three sections contain subsections. For example, the introduction contains two subsections, the hook and the thesis statement. Throughout this episode, we will learn about and practice writing these subsections, from the hook to the so what statement, in order to build a complete argumentative essay. Here, you can see the same basic structure. Usually, if you are asked to write an argumentative essay for homework, or if you are an advanced English learner, then you will probably need to write essays around 500 words in length. In this situation, the body section of your essay will have three arguments. One paragraph contains one argument, so this type of essay is often referred to as a 5-part essay. One paragraph for the introduction, 3 paragraphs for the arguments, and 1 paragraph for the conclusion. I have suggested approximate word lengths for each section and subsection. Of course, you do not need to follow these lengths exactly. Here is another structure for a type of argumentative essay. This is the type of essay you might need to write for an English exam, such as the IELTS Part 2 writing section or the TEM-4 writing exam. These essays are usually shorter, around 250 words. As a result, you only need to write 2 arguments, not 3, and the lengths for all sections are much shorter. Of course, remember that these lengths are only my suggestions, so you can write more or less for each section. Also, in a shorter essay, some subsections are optional. For example, you do not need to include the hook or the so what statement if you prefer. We will learn all about these sections in this episode. We shall start with the first subsection of the introduction, the hook. Apart from the title, The hook is the first words that the reader will see. It is the opening sentence of your essay. Because you need to make a good first impression on the reader, it must be interesting enough to get your reader's attention and keep that attention throughout the essay. If your hook is boring or cliché, or you don't have a hook and begin with the second section of the introduction, you will damage or even destroy the reader's interest in your entire essay. That's why it is so important to not only begin with a hook, which is quite easy to do, but to begin with an interesting hook. If you are not yet sure what makes a hook boring or cliché, then I'll show you some examples later in this episode. There are actually a lot of interesting hooks, and different books and websites always have different hooks. As a result, I've decided to show you my 6 favorite ways to start an essay. All of these are appropriate to begin an English essay. I'll firstly show you the least interesting of the 6 hooks. In this type, instead of writing something exciting or unusual, you provide the reader with background information about your topic. This is often called setting the scene. This type can be very useful if your topic is very unfamiliar to your reader. If it is unfamiliar, then before you present your opinion about the topic, which you will do in the second part of the introduction, which is called the thesis statement, you firstly need to explain the background of the topic to the reader. This can either be an explanation of an unfamiliar situation or a definition of an unfamiliar concept. We will look at examples of the 6 types of hook after I firstly introduce each type of hook. The second type of interesting hook could simply be called a contrast. But what do we contrast? And where? The contrast will be between the viewpoint in the hook and the writer's actual viewpoint, which is usually expressed in the second part of the introduction, called the thesis statement. Therefore, to use this type of hook, you must begin your essay by letting the reader believe that you actually support the other side of the topic. To do this, your hook will present an idea, situation, or statement which is actually opposite your point of view. After the hook, in the next sentence, you must explain that this opening statement is actually the opposite of your real viewpoint. And then you will present your thesis statement. Contrasts like this are very interesting for the reader, probably because it is unexpected and mysterious. The next interesting way to begin an essay is with an interesting story about yourself, a friend, or a famous person. This is called an anecdote. The topic of the anecdote will be directly relevant to the topic of the essay. The fourth interesting hook is to begin by quoting something. There are several types of quote. It could be a well-known quote, which your reader will almost certainly know. It could be the words of a famous person, whose name we can include with the quote. Or it could just be a famous saying or idiom, which cannot be attributed to a specific person. Another way to quote is to report something that a friend said to you. It could be important advice or a warning, and this person's words will directly lead to the topic of the essay. The fifth type of hook is to begin by asking a question. Now, in the real world, we ask a question when we want to find out the answer to something, because we genuinely don't know the answer to our question. However, if you use a question in your hook, it is not a genuine question, because actually, you already know the answer to your question. Therefore, to use a question in your hook, you firstly ask a question, and then immediately answer the question. This is a specific type of question, called a rhetorical question. This is an interesting type of hook because it is unexpected and exciting for the reader to read a question and then the answer to the question. Because, like I said, the real purpose of a question is to learn the answer. So, to read the answer immediately after you read the question is interesting. Finally, it can be very exciting to begin by stating a fact. Of course, many facts can be boring, so it is important to make the reader interested in your topic by choosing an interesting or controversial fact. This fact will be directly relevant to your topic, and ideally, it should shock or surprise the reader by telling him or her something unexpected. To make your fact even more shocking or surprising, you can include a statistic. This will be a number, a fraction, or a percentage. Let's look at some examples of these 6 hooks. Here are 2 examples to demonstrate the first type of hook. Firstly, for the topic, girls should split the bill when dating, the hook is: traditionally in our society, it is seen as a form of chivalry for the man to set the time, choose the restaurant, and pick up the bill for a first date. This provides the background information to the topic that girls should split the bill by firstly explaining the traditional situation. And we need this information to help us understand the writer's viewpoint in the essay. In the second example, for the topic, procrastination is necessary for university students, the hook is: procrastination is the action of delaying or postponing something which we need to do but don't want to do. For university students, this action is far too familiar. In this case, the writer decided that the most important word, procrastination, might be unfamiliar to the reader, and so began with a definition. Remember that if the reader doesn't understand the important aspects of your topic, he or she won't be interested in your essay and will probably stop reading. Thus, if aspects of your topic are unfamiliar or complex, then you should definitely provide extra information in the hook. Here are 2 examples of the type of hook that expresses a contrast. Firstly, for the topic, we should read newspapers, the hook is: for most people, mobile phones have become the main way to read news. This is unfortunate, however, because for several reasons, newspapers are a much better way. It begins by explaining what most people actually do, but then the second sentence argues that these people should actually do something else. Secondly, for the topic, exams should be abolished, the hook is: in most schools, exams are the most common method of deciding whether a student passes or fails. Although they are quite effective, their side effects are also enormous. Here, the writer begins by describing the common situation, but then claims that this situation is actually disadvantageous, and therefore will argue in his or her essay that this common situation should change. Here are 2 topics that begin with an anecdote. Firstly, for the topic, we should be prepared before we travel, the hook is: thinking back over my many travels, there was nothing more isolating than being alone in a foreign country, with no mobile phone, no money, and no ability to speak the language. We can see that the writer begins with a personal story about his or her own experience, which directly supports the writer's viewpoint. Secondly, for the topic, it is beneficial to continue education as adults, the hook is: every Tuesday and Friday evening, Miss Lee, my neighbour and a secretary in a company, rushes home after work, quickly eats her dinner, and then hurries out to get the bus for her English class. Miss Lee is not unique, because more and more city adults spend their free time improving themselves educationally. In this case, the writer is referring to the experiences of his or her neighbour, whose experience exemplifies the topic of the essay. In other words, the neighbour is an example of what the writer will argue for in the essay. Regarding quotes, I said that there are a few different ways that you can use a quote to begin an essay. I will show you two different ways here. Firstly, for the topic, real-world experience is just as important as textbook knowledge, the hook is, a man is never too old to learn. To me, this demonstrates that education is not a period of learning, such as going to school or university. It should be a lifelong process. This is not a quote that can be attributed to one person. Instead, it is a general saying or idiom that many people are familiar with. Secondly, for the topic, smoking should be illegal, the hook is, tobacco kills more than 5 million people every year, more than AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria combined, according to the World Health Organization. This is a very different type of quote, as it can be directly attributed to the spokesperson of an organization. Both types of quote are perfectly valid in an argumentative essay, so choose whichever is most appropriate for your topic. Before we continue, perhaps you noticed that the second example also contains a statistic: 5 million people every year. It is very common for hooks to contain more than one type. You will see more examples of this soon. Remember that a rhetorical question is not a genuine question. You ask it and then answer your question to grab the reader's attention. Let's look at two examples. Firstly, for the topic, being materialistic is good for individuals and for society. The hook is, what's one thing you can do to make the world a better place? Yes, that's right. Earn as much money as you can. The question and answer is very explicit and succinct in this example, but the rhetorical question may not always be so obvious. For example, in the second topic, Chinese universities need foreign teachers. Here, the hook is, what is the difference between Chinese teachers and foreign teachers, the two types of teacher at university? As a senior student, it is easy for me to see that they complement each other, as they both have strengths and weaknesses. Here, the answer to the difference is revealed in the next sentence, and this question and answer will lead directly to the writer's viewpoint that Chinese universities need foreign teachers. On to the sixth and final interesting type of hook now. We'll firstly look at two facts and then two statistics. Firstly, for the topic, girls should always wear makeup, the hook is, ancient Egyptians used eye makeup to keep evil spirits away and to protect their eyes from infection. This topic has the potential to be uninteresting or uninspiring to the reader, so the writer has chosen to begin with an unusual piece of information, which will eventually be linked directly to the writer's viewpoint. In the second topic, tall buildings are ugly, the hook is, with fast economic growth, many skyscrapers have appeared in the major cities of China in recent years. People's attitudes towards these giant buildings vary widely. This hook states two facts, and these will directly support the writer's viewpoint. Facts can also include statistics. For example, In the first topic, children of migrant workers should not need to pay more than local children for their education. The hook is, recent decades have seen an unprecedented wave of rural workers flooding into big cities. According to a 2017 survey, in Shanghai, there were more than 2.5 million migrant workers, almost all of whom left their children in their rural hometowns. Not only is the statistic a huge number, but the topic is also emotional. Both of these together make a hook very interesting. Regarding the second topic, cigarette companies should not be allowed to advertise. The hook is, over the last 15 years, China has experienced an alarming increase in teenage smoking. It rose from 8% in 2000 to 24% in 2017. These statistics are disturbing, and they cause people to ask why. This is of course a shocking statistic, and finishing the hook with "cause people to ask why" will make the reader want to continue reading your essay. Earlier, I said that it is very important to avoid boring hooks, as they will easily lose the reader's interest in your essay. Instead, you must use interesting hooks to grab the reader's attention immediately, which makes it much more likely that he or she will continue reading the rest of your essay. But what are boring hooks? Which hooks are boring? In my opinion, if a hook is used too much, especially by younger writers, such as those commonly used in high school essays, then it becomes cliché and uninteresting to most readers. Here are 3 examples of overused hooks. For the topic, phones should not be allowed in school, the first hook is, with the development of technology or society, every student has a phone in his or her pocket. The second hook is, the use of phones in the classroom is a hot topic, or the use of phones in the classroom has been heatedly discussed. And the third hook is, nowadays, the use of phones in the classroom has received widespread attention. These are acceptable for younger writers, such as high school students, but at an advanced level, one of the 6 interesting hooks is far more effective. We have learned about the 6 interesting hooks, but how do you choose which one to use? Are all of them equally acceptable, or are some more appropriate than others? Not every type of hook is appropriate for every topic. In my opinion, the nature of your essay topic will help you to narrow down which hooks to use. Ultimately, you must use your own judgment, because I cannot explain which hook to use in every situation. But here are a few thoughts. Firstly, if your topic is based on your own feelings and emotions, or inspired by your personal experiences, then an anecdote will be very relevant. You can see some example topics here. In the topic, unused mobile phone internet data should be added to the next month's amount, you could begin by explaining how annoyed you were when you went on holiday abroad for 3 weeks, thus hardly using any of your phone's internet data, even though you were still paying for it, and then it was all wasted when you returned. And this anger gave you the motivation to support this viewpoint. For the topic, eating and drinking on the metro should be forbidden, you could share with the reader your story of walking onto the metro train after a very long, tiring day, then slipping over and hitting your head on the floor. Dazed, confused, and in pain, you slowly get up to see what happened, only to find the remains of a banana that an old man had dropped on the floor of the train a few minutes earlier. You are angry and adopt the viewpoint that it is never acceptable to eat or drink on the metro. You can see that these anecdotes are very personal, and the writer passionately holds his or her viewpoint because of these stories. Therefore, it is more interesting than something like a definition, which doesn't have the same emotional connection to the topic. In contrast, if the topic is less emotional and more scientific, and not personally connected to the writer's own experiences, then statistics or facts will be very interesting for the reader. For example, in the topic, "The rapid development of online shopping has a bad effect on our lives," you could begin with a shocking statistic about the number of real-world physical shops that have closed because more people shop online. For the topic, "We should enhance our awareness of recycling," you could present statistics about the amount of plastic in the ocean and the number of animals that are killed each year by it. This will directly lead to the viewpoint that recycling is better than simply throwing rubbish into general bins or even on the floor. Finally, if your topic is very specific and perhaps unknown to the reader, then beginning with background information or a definition helps to provide necessary context to the reader, which he or she will need in order to better understand your viewpoint. For example, for the 3 topics on the screen now, you can begin by providing essential information about these concepts, which the reader will need to be able to understand your viewpoint about them. In other words, your reader might not fully understand your opinion about these concepts if the reader doesn't firstly have basic knowledge about them. And the 3 topics on the screen are: fracking should be encouraged, GMOs are harmful, unpaid internships should be illegal. Ultimately, you will need to make a decision about which hook is the most appropriate for your topic. For some topics, more than one hook will be acceptable, so you will have several options to choose. Let's now do some activities about hooks. After I read these 2 hooks, please pause the video and decide which hook is more interesting and why. Think of at least 3 reasons and what the effect of these reasons is. Firstly, setting the scene. 21 teachers from across the UK gathered at Cambridge University from October 8th to October 10th to learn how to write poetry. Secondly, an anecdote. Mr. Smith cried as he composed a poem about his grandmother at the keyboard of a computer in the dusty basement of Cambridge University's library. The second hook is definitely more interesting than the first. In fact, the first feels more like a newspaper report. I can think of 3 reasons why the second is more interesting. Firstly, it is suspenseful, because it doesn't reveal all of the information to the reader immediately, which forces him or her to keep reading to find out why Mr. Smith is there. Secondly, it is detailed and specific. For example, it says the dusty basement, not just the basement. Finally, it is emotional, because we learn that Mr. Smith was not only writing a poem, but that he cried as he wrote it. Overall, these 3 reasons are effective in making the reader want to keep reading. In the next activity, here are 3 hooks. They are all on the topic of C-sections. Pause the video and decide which type of hook they are. Continue when you have finished. The first hook: Dr. Wang told a Chinese journalist that the pain and unpredictability of giving birth terrified her, and so she decided that she would go to extreme lengths to have a planned C-section, is a quote. The second hook: A C-section is the surgical incision of the walls of the abdomen and uterus for the delivery of offspring, is a definition. And the third hook, Dr. Wang says that there has been an increase of almost 3% in the number of C-section births in industrialized societies, is a fact which contains a statistic. You could also say that the third hook is a quote, as it paraphrases what Dr. Wang said. Depending on the writer's topic and his or her viewpoint, one hook might be more appropriate than the others. In our next activity, here are 6 hooks for the essay topic, Smoking should be banned in all public places. To be clear, this topic is not about banning smoking in general, but about banning it only in public places. Therefore, it focuses more on non-smokers than smokers. Your task is to decide which type of hook they are. Pause the video after I read it, because I will reveal the answer afterwards. Here is a statistic that won't surprise you. Smokers are 50% more likely to get lung cancer than non-smokers. Now, here is a statistic that might surprise you. Second-hand smokers, who don't smoke at all but are often nearby smokers, are 30% more likely to get lung cancer. Myself and many others think this is deeply wrong and unfair, which is why I believe that this hook is definitely a statistic, as the word statistic is used twice in the hook itself. The 2 percentages are used to introduce the topic of the essay. If I asked you whether you think it is possible for non-smokers who are surrounded by smokers to get lung cancer from breathing the smoky air, what would your answer be? I'm sure many of you would be shocked to learn that the answer is absolutely yes. As a result, it is undeniable that... Please pause the video now and decide which type it is. This hook contains a question, which is answered immediately after it is asked. Therefore, it is a rhetorical question. According to the Chinese Environmental Protection Agency, second-hand smoke causes approximately 3,000 lung cancer deaths in non-smokers each year. I was angered when I learned this, so I will argue in my essay that this hook is a quote from a reputable expert organization. When I was an undergrad, I worked part-time as a waitress. The thick cloud of cigarette smoke inside the pokey restaurant always left me short of breath at the end of a long shift. But I never thought anything of it until one day I fainted. The doctor told me I had developed asthma from the smoke-filled air. More people need to be aware of the dangers of second-hand smoke. So without a doubt, I believe that this hook is an anecdote, because the writer is thinking back to his or her previous experiences and using the experiences to introduce and support his or her point of view. If you walked around shops and restaurants and asked customers about the change they would like to see the most, probably none of them would choose a ban on smoking in public places. However, I believe most people haven't yet realized how important this is for our society, and this is why I will argue that this hook is a contrast, because the first sentence seems to support not banning smoking in public places. But when we see the word however, we know that there will be a contrast between the previous sentence and the next sentence, and this contrast is actually that the writer will argue that a ban is nevertheless a good idea. Public smoking bans have been enacted in several countries in recent years, but China is still not part of this growing trend. This is causing many members of the public to ask why not, and ask when we will be able to eat in smoke-free restaurants and stroll in smoke-free parks. I am one of those many people who want a ban, and so I will argue this hook is background information, because it sets the scene by providing the necessary context to help the reader understand the topic of the essay. After knowing this, the reader will be fully able to appreciate the writer's point of view. In our final activity about hooks, here are 5 hooks for the essay topic: students should begin long-distance relationships when they go to university. In case this topic is confusing, it means that if 2 people are in a relationship before they go to university in different cities, they should not break up. Instead, their relationship should continue, but they should begin a long-distance relationship. Like before, your task is to decide which type of hook they are. Pause the video after I read it, because I will reveal the answer afterwards. In this first hook, there are actually 2 types of hook here. I'll read it, then pause the video to decide which type they are. Can distance really make the heart grow fonder? My first answer to this question was a definite no. How could a long-distance relationship be better than all the benefits of a face-to-face relationship, such as companionship, communication, and sex? However, after thinking about this subject, it's clear that there are pros and cons to both types of relationship, which has changed my opinion on the subject. So, in my essay, I will argue that firstly, it should be obvious that there are 2 questions here, both of which are answered. Therefore, this hook contains rhetorical questions. Secondly, remember that the writer's viewpoint is that couples should enter long-distance relationships. But the writer's original answer is that he or she was not a fan of long-distance relationships. Therefore, because the writer's opinion changes from the beginning to the end of the hook, this is also a contrast. Here is the second hook. Absence makes the heart grow fonder is one of those ridiculous yet inspirational quotes which are told to couples during their first long-distance relationship. Oh, your boyfriend of 3 years is going to university in another country? You can do it. Distance makes the heart grow stronger. This is the topic of my essay. It should be clear that this is a quote. In fact, there are 2 quotes, and the writer even tells us that he or she began with a quote. Here is the third hook. I am very forgetful, but if I think back to 2 years ago, during my first week at university, someone told me a statement that I will never forget. Your long-distance relationship won't last. Right from the beginning, I defied this. I like a challenge, and no one was allowed to dictate my relationship. Now, 2 years later, I am still in my very happy long-distance relationship. This is why I believe that this does include a quote, but I think it is more likely to be an anecdote. The writer is thinking back to his or her previous experiences and uses these experiences to introduce and support his or her point of view. Here is the fourth quote. In 2018, over 2 million couples were in long-distance relationships in the UK. This number includes 50,000 married couples in England. The most common long-distance relationships however, involve university students. These relationships can be successful, especially considering modern technology. So, I will argue in my essay that this is definitely a statistic, because there is a year and two huge numbers, and these are used to introduce the topic of the essay. Finally, here is the fifth quote. The end of summer doesn't just mean it's time to go back to work or back to school. For many university students, autumn also signals a return to their hated long-distance relationship. There are mixed feelings about this type of relationship, and today I will present my view that we have only one type of hook left, so it must be background information. You can see that this hook sets the scene by providing the necessary context to help the reader understand the topic of the essay, which is that the end of summer means going back to school and entering a long-distance relationship. After knowing this, the reader will be fully able to appreciate the writer's point of view. Let's now move on to the second section of the introduction, the thesis statement. In a typical argumentative essay, the thesis statement should be one sentence, which will appear at the end of the introduction directly after the hook. The most effective thesis statements consist of two parts. Firstly, the writer succinctly states his or her central main point of view. In other words, if you asked the writer the question, "What is your essay about?" he or she would tell you the thesis statement. Secondly, the writer briefly states the reasons why he or she has that viewpoint. Remember that your viewpoint on the topic is supported with arguments or reasons why you hold that viewpoint. In a typical argumentative essay, you should present between 2 and 3 strong reasons. Of course, you will present your reasons in detail in the main section of the essay, which is called the body of the essay. However, it is essential to briefly introduce your 2 to 3 reasons in the second part of the thesis statement. This is because providing a summary of your main reasons or arguments at the end of the introduction prepares your reader for what you will discuss, which will help him or her to follow and understand the detail that you'll provide in the body section. Let's look at an example. Here is a complete introduction for the topic we saw earlier. Students should begin long-distance relationships when they go to university. Can distance really make the heart grow fonder? My first answer to this question was a definite no. How could a long-distance relationship be better than all the benefits of a face-to-face relationship, such as companionship, communication, and sex? However, after thinking about this subject, it's clear that there are pros and cons to both types of relationship, which has changed my opinion on the subject. So, in my essay, I will argue that long-distance relationships can indeed be hugely beneficial for university students, not only for the couples themselves, but also the society as a whole. You can see that it contains 2 parts. The red part is the statement of the writer's viewpoint, and the blue part is the summary of the writer's reasons. Doing this prepares your reader for why you believe your point of view. This means that, before the reader has begun to hear the body of the essay, which is the main part that contains the detailed discussion of the writer's reasons, he or she has already been introduced to and prepared for the main information that will be presented in the body of the essay. Therefore, the reader already knows that he or she will learn about the benefits of long-distance relationships for couples and for the society. Preparing the reader for this will aid his or her understanding of your arguments, because having knowledge of the most important information will help him or her to follow your arguments and appreciate the additional details. Let's now look at two possible arguments. Because the reader has been prepared for them, he or she will know that the essay will discuss the benefits to couples and to society. This existing knowledge will help the reader to understand the detailed explanation of the two arguments. For example, what was summarized in the thesis statement as benefits for the couples becomes the couples will deepen their spiritual connection if they are not physically together, which is very healthy for long-term relationships. And benefits for the society becomes people who have experienced long-distance relationships have better communication and trust, which will benefit society as a whole. It would be more difficult for the reader to appreciate the detail of these arguments if he or she hasn't been prepared for them in the introduction, which is why you must include a summary of them in your thesis statement. Writing an excellent thesis statement is not easy, and there are 5 common ways that thesis statements can be weak and ineffective. For this reason, I have 5 pieces of advice for ensuring that you have a strong, effective thesis statement. Firstly, a high-quality thesis statement is not a fact or a summary of facts. It must be the writer's viewpoint about the topic, and this viewpoint is an opinion that can be argued. To demonstrate this, look at the example of a fact and an opinion that can be argued from the fact. The fact is, many countries have already illegalized smoking in public places. The opinion is, China should follow the trend of other countries by illegalizing smoking in public places. The fact is a simple, truthful claim that can easily be proven, so it is not a viewpoint. Instead, the opinion is a belief that can be argued, using the fact as supporting evidence. If you are still confused, then I recommend you to research the differences between facts and opinions. Secondly, the amount of detail in the thesis statement must be appropriate for the length of your essay. For example, in a 250-word essay, it must be specific, focused, and narrow, because the essay will only contain a small amount of information that needs to be summarized. However, in a huge 2,500-word essay, the thesis statement needs to be general enough to include all the main viewpoints that will be discussed in that lengthy essay. So, for a typical argumentative essay, which is between 250 and 500 words, you must ensure that the thesis statement is not vague and general, and instead covers your viewpoint as clearly and precisely as possible. Thirdly, the thesis statement must clearly and directly state the writer's opinion. There are 2 common mistakes regarding this that result in weak thesis statements. Firstly, a thesis statement might include 2 opposing, contrasting sides of the topic, such as a positive and a negative aspect. Secondly, the thesis statement might be tentative when stating which side of the topic to support in the essay. If you are from an Asian country, then this might sound surprising or even incorrect to you, because it is very common in argumentative essays from these cultures to do 2 things. Firstly, to not strongly choose only one point of view, and instead to include both points of view in a way that minimizes confrontation. And secondly, to not strongly support one side and only tentatively support it. However, in an English argumentative essay, doing these produces a poor essay, because it weakens the strength of your point of view and limits your persuasiveness. Thus, in an English argumentative essay, you must choose only one side of the debate and very strongly argue for the advantages of only that side. Here are 3 examples of weak thesis statements that fall into the trap of not clearly and directly stating the writer's opinion. I'll now read them. There are both advantages and disadvantages of banning smoking in public places, and I will explore both of these in my essay. Smoking in public places is a basic human right, but it also harms non-smokers' human rights. I quite agree that smoking should be banned in public places. As you can see, the first two attempt to include two opposing aspects of the topic, either both the advantages and disadvantages, or two specific opposing ideas. In the third, even if it is true that the writer only quite agrees with his or her chosen viewpoint, English argumentative essays must either strongly agree or strongly disagree. The fourth feature of a strong, effective thesis statement is related to the language you use. Specifically, your tone must be as strong and confident in the thesis statement as possible. This means that you must avoid beginning the thesis statement with phrases like, "in my opinion," "I think that," "I believe," or "I feel," because these sound like your viewpoint is weak and your belief in your topic lacks confidence. Another reason to avoid these phrases is that they are simply a waste of words, because the point of an argumentative essay is to share your opinions, beliefs, and feelings. Instead, you can simply delete these phrases and say the rest of the sentence. Without these phrases, the thesis statement will sound more confident and powerful. Finally, the fifth feature of a high-quality thesis statement is to avoid using the most common yet simplistic structure for the thesis statement. This is, the topic should be adjective. This kind of thesis statement presents the writer's viewpoint in the most simplistic way possible. Because most people will use this, you can stand out from everyone else by using a more interesting thesis statement. This will certainly catch the attention of the reader and improve the overall quality of your essay. Let's look at some examples of more interesting, as well as stronger and more confident, thesis statements. We'll again use the topic, "Smoking should be banned in public places." A typical thesis statement might be, "In my opinion, smoking should be banned in public places, and here are my reasons." Instead, you could say, "It is clear to me that the benefits of banning smoking in public places outweigh the negatives. This is due to," and then present your reasons. It is undeniable that banning smoking in public places is totally necessary for 3 reasons. Undoubtedly, smoking in public places must be banned immediately because, as far as I'm concerned, it is essential that smoking be banned in public places. This is because I strongly agree that smoking be banned in public places due to. In my essay, I will argue that it is right to ban smoking in public for 3 reasons. This is why I believe that smoking in public must be stopped now. I will present my view that smoking in public must be illegalized, and I have 3 reasons for this. Also, to be more unusual and interesting, you could present your thesis statement as a question, such as, "Isn't it obvious that smoking should be banned in public places?" And then you can present your answer to the question in the body section. Finally, another way to do it, which also keeps your introduction short, is to combine the hook and the thesis statement. For example, my viewpoint is encapsulated in the following quote by a famous surgeon: "Smoking should be banned in all public places." This could be your entire introduction, and it is unusual and effective. Let's do an activity to check our understanding of the 5 principles. On the next page are 7 thesis statements. You must firstly decide whether they are strong or weak. Strong means that they follow all three principles, and weak means that at least one principle is broken. Secondly, for the weak thesis statements, decide which principle has been broken. Finally, either rewrite the weak thesis statements or decide how to improve them. And these thesis statements are all for 250-word argumentative essays. Although smoking is bad for our health, it is also very good for inspiration. It takes 3 years for Chinese students to get a master's degree, but only 1 year for UK students. Because of the popularity of social media, companies should focus on online advertising. Men and women are different in many ways. Volunteering is beneficial to university students in that it cultivates their interpersonal skills. In my opinion, I believe that studying abroad is the most valuable experience for university students. Assisted suicide should be legalized. Now, please pause the video and complete this activity. Continue when you have finished. Here are the answers. Thesis statement 1 is weak because it includes 2 aspects of the topic. Therefore, principle 3 has been broken. To fix it, you can simply remove either the first or the second aspect, depending on whether you want to argue the positives or negatives of smoking. Next, thesis statement 2 is also weak because it is a fact, not an opinion that can be argued. To fix it, we must form an opinion about the fact, either positive or negative. For example, you could argue that because the UK's master's degrees are much shorter, they include much less information and depth, and so the system is less rigorous than China's. Or you could form a completely different opinion from the same fact and argue instead that if the same amount of information is taught in the UK in a much shorter time, then the UK university system is more efficient than China's. So, you can see it is interesting that the same fact can be used to support 2 completely different points of view. Principle 3 is strong. There are no problems at all with this thesis statement. Thesis statement 4 breaks principle 2, because it is very unlikely that many aspects could be discussed in detail in 250 words. Thus, it is too general for the length of the essay. To fix it, you could simply focus on only one aspect, such as men and women have different shopping habits, or men and women are different biologically. Next, thesis statement 5 is strong. The 6th thesis statement is weak because the beginning makes the writer seem unconfident about his or her viewpoint. Therefore, to make it stronger, we can simply delete the unnecessary words. In my opinion, I think that. Without these words, the thesis statement is, studying abroad is the most valuable experience for university students, which sounds much more convincing. Finally, thesis statement 7 is also weak because it uses the most simple and boring structure possible. You must avoid this kind of structure if you want to get a high grade in your English essays. Instead, you can use one of the more interesting structures that I just showed you. We've finished talking about creating an effective introduction, so let's now move on to the main section of the essay, the body. As briefly mentioned before, the body is in the middle of your essay, and it is the main section of your essay. In this section, you will present, explain, and justify the reasons for why you have your point of view. And remember that you state your point of view in the thesis statement. The analogy that is often used for an argumentative essay is a burger. The introduction and the conclusion are the bread, and the body is the meat. As we said at the beginning, an argumentative essay gets its name from the fact that you must present arguments. In this situation, argument does not mean an angry disagreement with someone else, which usually involves shouting. In terms of an essay, argument is synonymous with reason. So your arguments are your reasons for why you hold your viewpoint. In a typical argumentative essay, I would expect to see at least 2, and at most 3, detailed arguments. If your essay is quite short, between 200 and 300 words, then I recommend only 2 arguments. And if it is 300 to 500 words, then you have enough words to write 3 detailed arguments. For a short essay, even if you have 3 strong arguments to share with the reader, it is better to write fewer arguments with more detail than more arguments with little detail. So, you can make this decision based on the requirements of your argumentative essay. But how do you arrange and organize your arguments in the body section? I highly recommend that you put each argument into a separate paragraph. So, each paragraph in the body section will contain 1 argument. Therefore, for example, if your essay has 3 main arguments, your body section has 3 paragraphs. Sometimes, students choose to write all 3 arguments in one huge paragraph, so that when you look at the entire essay as a whole, it has the burger shape that I mentioned. However, it can be very difficult to follow your arguments if they are not clearly arranged into separate paragraphs. So, even if your argument paragraphs are quite short, maybe even shorter than your introduction paragraph, don't worry, it is not a problem. Each body paragraph, so each argument, should contain the same 3 parts. Your argument must begin with a topic sentence, then you will support your reason, and finally, you will conclude with a wrap-up sentence. Let's now look at each section of the body in more detail. We'll start with the topic sentence and wrap-up, and finish with the support. The topic sentence, which each argument must begin with, is a 1-sentence summary of that argument. Let's look at an example from the topic about long-distance relationships. The topic is, students should begin long-distance relationships when they go to university. The thesis statement is, long-distance relationships can indeed be hugely beneficial for university students, not only for the couples themselves, but also the society as a whole. And the first topic sentence is, couples will deepen their spiritual connection if they are not physically together, which is very healthy for long-term relationships. From this, we can clearly see the connection between the topic, the thesis statement, and the topic sentence, especially if the thesis statement includes a summary of the body's arguments. We will explore the support section of the body in more detail soon, but for now, I can briefly say that, immediately after your topic sentence, you must justify why your topic sentence is valid and correct by supporting it with additional information, detail, examples, and most importantly, evidence. After that, you will conclude your argument by presenting the final sentence of the body paragraph, the wrap-up sentence. Importantly, it is not a conclusion of your entire essay, but a conclusion of the argument. The easiest way to write a wrap-up sentence is to echo the topic sentence. In other words, it should repeat the meaning of the topic sentence. Therefore, it must not repeat the same words, it must instead use different words. To show the reader that the writer has reached the wrap-up sentence should begin with a phrase that shows the result of something. For example, because of this, in a word, as a result, consequently, therefore. Do not use the phrases that you would begin the conclusion with, like to conclude or to close this off, because these sound too final and too extreme for a summary of each argument. Here is an example to demonstrate this. The topic: students should begin long-distance relationships when they go to university. The topic sentence: couples will deepen their spiritual connection if they are not physically together, which is very healthy for long-term relationships. And the wrap-up sentence: therefore, it is clear that a long-distance relationship will increase the likelihood of becoming spiritually connected. Before we move on, I should say that some textbooks state that the wrap-up sentence is optional. Personally, I disagree, because I think the wrap-up sentence has a very important function: to show the reader that your argument has nearly finished, and to provide him or her with a convenient summary of the main theme of your argument. This will undoubtedly increase the argument's persuasiveness and the persuasiveness of your essay overall. In between the topic sentence, which is the introduction to your reason, and the wrap-up sentence, which is the conclusion of your reason, is the justification of your reason. To do this, you could choose to support it with additional information or a more detailed explanation about your reason. However, both of these are much less effective than the most effective form of support, which is called evidence. We will now explore this in detail. We can define evidence as a piece of information that helps us to make a conclusion or judgment about something. When I hear this word, I don't think of argumentative essays. I immediately think of this word in a legal setting. It reminds me of courts, lawyers, justice, and a criminal trial which determines guilt or innocence. In this setting, a lawyer must use evidence to convince the judge that someone is either guilty or innocent of a crime. Therefore, the judgment that must be made is whether he or she is guilty or innocent, and the information that is used to help make this judgment is evidence. In an argumentative essay, which is admittedly less exciting than a court, the writer is similar to a lawyer, because the writer must use evidence effectively to convince the reader that his or her argument is a good argument. A more academic way to say a good argument is a valid argument. So, the writer must convince the reader that his or her arguments are valid, and this is achieved by using evidence effectively. To summarize, you must use evidence to make your reasons more convincing, understandable, and clearer for the reader. But how do we determine whether something is valid? This is actually a huge question, which would take a very long time to adequately explain here. To keep it short, I'll just say that to be valid, which simply means that the argument is acceptable to use in your essay, an argument must be rational. In other words, if an argument is rational, then it becomes valid for you to use in your essay. So, the next question is what makes an argument rational. I believe there are two main aspects. To be rational, it must be logical and reasonable. To be logical, the evidence that supports the argument must be connected in a way that makes sense. For example, my argument is that it is dangerous to drive now. My evidence is that it is always dangerous to drive when it is snowing, and it is snowing now. In this example, the evidence logically connects to the argument. They would not logically connect if you used the same evidence, but instead argued that it is safe to drive right now. If an argument is reasonable, then it is fair and sensible. For example, Without a time machine to go into the future, I can reasonably argue that the sun will rise tomorrow, because it has risen every day in history, and there is no evidence that anything has changed that would cause the sun to not rise tomorrow. An unreasonable argument is to claim that the sun will not rise tomorrow because we cannot predict the future. There are many types of evidence, and some types are more valid than others. In fact, we can roughly put the major types of evidence into two groups: less valid evidence, which are more subjective types of evidence, and more valid evidence, which are more objective types. Please pause the video now to think of types of evidence that can be used in an argumentative essay. Let's now have a look at more and less valid types of evidence. There are three types of less valid evidence. Firstly, analogies, which are a specific type of comparison. Understanding how to use these effectively requires some explanation, so we will learn more about them later in this episode. Secondly, you could use anecdotes, which are a story about something from your own experience, or a story about the experience of friends or family, or a famous story about a celebrity, for instance. Finally, is the least valid type of evidence, which is called common sense. I will show you many examples of common sense in this episode, and will explain why it is a very poor quality form of evidence. It is certainly the least valid evidence on this list. You can use it when having a friendly debate with some friends, but you must avoid it as support for an argument in an essay. In the more valid group, there are four common types of evidence to use to support your arguments. Firstly, you could refer to an important or famous event or phenomenon which your reader will be familiar with. This could be something that was widely reported in the news, for example, and it could either be current or historical. Next, you could use the opinion of an expert in the field of your essay topic, such as a university professor or a famous organization. You could quote the expert directly or paraphrase their words. Thirdly, statistics from a valid source, such as a scientific report, a book, academic article, or newspaper article, are perhaps the most convincing sources of evidence, as long as they come from a high-quality source. Thus, this is one of the best types of evidence to use. Finally, you could use a theory, a model, or a principle. These certainly require some explanation, and you will find this later in this episode. In general, theories, models, and principles are an idea or a set of ideas that explain how something works and why something happens or exists. They are very useful forms of evidence. There are thousands of theories, models, and principles about every subject, so of course you can only use a theory, model, or a principle if you already know about it. So, there are 7 basic types of evidence, or 6 if you ignore common sense. But which types should you rely on to create a persuasive essay? To answer this, let's briefly return to the context of a criminal trial. If a man is accused of murder, then the victim's lawyer will use evidence to convince the judge that the man is guilty. The lawyer could use many types of evidence, but some will be more convincing than others. For example, the lawyer could read the testimony of a witness who claims that he or she saw someone who looks like the accused man running nearby the scene of the murder. However, the witness is not 100% certain that the person running away was the accused man, nor is the witness 100% certain that the person was running away directly from the scene of the murder. This is called circumstantial evidence, and is certainly not valid enough to reasonably decide whether the man is guilty. In contrast, if there were many direct witnesses who stood in front of the accused man while the murder happened, they all filmed it on their phones, and there were also security cameras which filmed the murder, then this evidence is far more convincing and therefore valid. Using this evidence alone, the accused man would most likely be found guilty. Back to argumentative essays, this means that more valid or objective evidence alone can effectively support an argument, but less valid or subjective evidence cannot support an argument on its own. To be blunt, objective evidence always gets a higher grade, so you should only use objective evidence as the core support for your arguments. So, when can you use subjective evidence? For example, if you have an amazing anecdote that you really want to share with the reader, then you can use it to add additional support to the argument that was already supported with objective evidence. Thus, you can use an anecdote alongside a statistic, for example. However, do remember that you cannot use common sense because it is far too weak for an argumentative essay. Let's now explore two of these types of evidence in more detail: analogies and theories. Firstly, we'll discuss analogies, which can be a useful type of evidence to support an objective type of evidence. Most simply, an analogy is a form of comparison. You will use an analogy if your argument is difficult to understand or contains information that is unfamiliar to your reader. By using an analogy, you make your argument easier to understand. To demonstrate how to use comparison to make your argument easier to understand, let's use the argument that Toyota cars are better than BMW cars. For the sake of this example, although I just made it up, let's say that the important background information which the reader should know is that Toyota cars are more expensive but better quality, and BMW cars are cheaper but lower quality. If I am the reader of your essay, then you will need to work harder to help me understand your arguments, because I know nothing about cars, especially not the differences between different brands of cars. And if the topic is unfamiliar to me, then I am less likely to understand and thus be persuaded by your arguments. You can use an analogy to help me understand your argument by comparing the principles of the difference between the two brands of car to something that is easier to understand, or something that the reader is more familiar with. Before we look at what comparison you could use, I should say that an analogy is not your only option in this situation. Instead, you could simply provide more information to the reader and explain that Toyota cars are more expensive but better quality, and BMW cars are cheaper but lower quality. However, that is not very interesting. Instead, you can use an analogy which also compares two types of product, because this is the same principle as which car is better. I have chosen the analogy of the choice between buying two types of simple product. The product I have chosen is apples, because I'm sure that all of us have wanted to buy apples before and needed to make a choice in the shop about which apple to buy. I'll now read the analogy. Toyota cars are like the perfect, crunchy, organic, glistening red apples at the top of the pile of apples, whereas BMW cars are like the rotting, soft, small apples that have been sitting at the bottom of the pile for weeks. Any reasonable shopper would buy the fresh, perfect apples instead of the rotting ones that should be thrown away. Similar to the apples, few people would purchase a poorly made, low-quality car. As you can see, at the end of this example, the writer returns to the discussion about cars and links the discussion of apples to it. After this, the reader should understand the principles involved in the writer's arguments. I realize that theories, models, and principles sound very abstract, so let's look at some of my favorite theories, models, and principles. These will not be appropriate for every essay topic, but they will demonstrate why theories, models, and principles are a valuable form of evidence, instead of statistics from a scientific study, which are easy to overuse. I have divided the theories that I will share with you into 3 groups: general, economic, and psychological theories. My explanations are deliberately simplified, so I might have omitted some details. Thus, if a theory particularly interests you, then please research it yourself to learn more information. Firstly, here are some interesting theories that can help to explain phenomena in life in general. The first theory is called Occam's razor. This theory states that if something happens and there are 2 possible explanations, the explanation that requires the fewest assumptions is usually correct. In other words, an explanation is more unlikely if you need to make more assumptions. Or even more simply, the simplest explanation is most likely to be correct. Let's look at an example. If you see a woman running towards a bus at a bus station, you might create 2 explanations. Firstly, she is running away from the ghost of her dead husband, whom she just murdered. Secondly, she wants to catch the bus before it leaves. The first explanation requires several assumptions. The woman was married, she is a murderer, ghosts exist, ghosts are evil and want revenge, and so on. The second explanation does not require any assumptions. Therefore, the second one is more likely to be correct. Next is the principle of least effort. This theory states that if an animal, person, or even a machine must do something, it instinctively does it in the most effortless way. This theory can explain a variety of phenomena, but it is commonly used to explain why English is becoming simpler over time. For example, because it is more common to make plural with s, words like gooses instead of geese have slowly appeared, and will eventually replace the more difficult to remember word. Also, past tense verbs like swam and dove are slowly being replaced by swimmed and dived. Finally, regarding pronunciation, letters can swap in a word to become easier to say. For example, wasp used to be wops, bird used to be brid, horse used to be hross. The third theory I want to share with you is the Pareto principle, which is also known as the 80-20 rule. Its name comes from the fact that, for many events, roughly 80% of the effects come from 20% of the causes. For example, it is often observed that when students are working in groups, 80% of the work is completed by 20% of the group members. Secondly, in an agency which rents apartments, 80% of the sales come from 20% of the agents. And thirdly, in a noisy primary school classroom, 80% of the noise comes from 20% of the children. Godwin's law is a very interesting theory. If you are not from a Western country, then you have probably not experienced this due to cultural differences. But in the West, it is really common. During a discussion, either on the internet or in person, if a person begins to lose the argument, it is increasingly likely that he or she will call the other person a Nazi. Because the Nazis did terrible things, a person during a debate uses this attack to quickly end the debate. This is because no one wants to be compared to a Nazi, so he or she will probably stop debating with the losing person. Next is Murphy's Law. This law states that anything that can go wrong will go wrong. It is a rather tongue-in-cheek theory, but this kind of thing definitely happens to all of us occasionally. Here are some examples. Firstly, if you are not looking for something, it is exactly where it should be. But when you finally need it, it has disappeared and you can't find it. Secondly, after you get home from the supermarket, you remember that you forgot to buy the only item that you wanted to buy. Thirdly, your favorite product always gets discontinued or changed to become worse. Now, let's look at the second group of theories, which originated from the field of economics. Even though they originally explained economic phenomena, they can be used to explain a wider range of phenomena in the world. The first theory is called the law of diminishing returns. This states that, during a process of doing something or making something, if you keep increasing the input, at some point the output will decrease. In other words, more input eventually leads to less output. To be honest, the economics examples are difficult for me to understand, so I prefer to use non-economics examples. Firstly, if you study for 8 hours instead of 4 hours, you probably won't have double the amount of knowledge, because you will get tired, distracted, and bored. Secondly, regarding weightlifting, your muscles are not twice as big if you do 6 days a week instead of 3 days a week, because your muscles grow afterwards, when you are resting. So, if you do not have enough time to rest, your muscles will not grow as fast. The second theory is the decoy effect. I'll explain this with an example. You go to a shop to buy a cup of coffee, and you want a medium-sized cup. However, the shop only has 2 sizes. Small is £2, and large is £6. It is very likely that you will choose the small, because the large seems too expensive. However, if there is a medium size which costs £4, it is likely you will choose the medium. But the shop really wants you to buy a large size and spend the most money, so a medium size actually costs £5.50. In this situation, it is very likely that you will buy a large size, because it is only 50 pence more. In conclusion, a business can make more money if they convert the customer from someone looking for a cheap product into someone looking for value for money. The theory of supply and demand states that if the supply of something is the same but the demand for it is lower, the price will decrease. And if the demand is higher, the price will increase. Let's look at 2 examples. Firstly, if there is a drought which reduces the amount of strawberries that are grown and available to buy, there are fewer strawberries than the number of people who want to buy them. As a result, the price of strawberries increases dramatically. Secondly, in the off-peak season, few people go on holiday. As a result, the price of hotel rooms in tourist areas decrease, because there are more hotel rooms than the number of tourists. Let's now look at the third group of theories, which can be used to explain psychological phenomena. Firstly is the sunk cost effect. This theory states that people often continue to do something only because they have already invested time and/or money into it, even though they should logically stop doing it. Here are 3 examples. Firstly, if you are late for an appointment and you've waited for the bus for 30 minutes, it is very likely that you will continue to wait for the bus even though you could get a taxi and not miss your appointment, only because you already invested 30 minutes. Secondly, if you are unhappy in your relationship, you are more likely to stay together if you have been together for 3 years instead of 3 months. And thirdly, if you have clothes in your wardrobe that you don't like and don't wear anymore, you are more likely to keep the expensive ones than the cheap ones, even if you don't wear either of them. The second theory related to psychology is called groupthink. This states that the desire to be a member of a group who all agree with and support each other is more important than the desire to make rational, logical decisions. So, it is quite common for a group to eventually make dangerous, harmful decisions simply because no member wants to disagree with the other members. Most of the examples I can think of are very culture-specific, so it might not make much sense. Here is just one example. In 1986, the USA's spaceship Challenger exploded just after it launched. It was later revealed that the engineers secretly disagreed with the launch, but they were too scared to tell the managers as they thought they might get fired if the launch were delayed. The third theory is called confirmation bias. This states that people are more likely to pay attention to information that supports their beliefs and opinions, and ignore information that challenges them. For example, firstly, when people know that I am left-handed, they often say, "Oh, that makes sense, because you play the piano, and left-handed people are very creative." When they say this, they ignore the fact that I am more interested in writing, logic, and science, which are characteristics associated with right-handed people, than I am interested in the piano. They do this to fit my information within their existing beliefs about left versus right-handed people. Here is a second example of confirmation bias. There is a big problem with gun control in the USA. Regarding a case from a few years ago, a gunman attacked a school and murdered innocent children. The murderer was eventually killed by a teacher who had a gun in his office. Afterwards, 2 members of the public hear about the case. Person A supports guns, and Person B opposes guns. Both people will use the same story to support their viewpoint. Person A focuses on the fact that the teacher killed the gunman because he had a gun, and Person B focuses on the fact that the children would be alive if the gunman did not have a gun. Both people focus on different information to support their opposite viewpoints. The final theory I want to share with you is called the bystander effect. It states that individuals are less likely to help a victim when other people are also there. The effect is that they just stand and watch, or more recently, film it on their phones. The fewer the number of people, the more likely they are to help the victim. For example, if someone faints in a crowded public place, the people surrounding him or her are less likely to help, compared to someone fainting in a rural area when only one other person is nearby. In that situation, the one person is much more likely to help. Let's look at an example of each type of evidence. For this, I'll use the topic, smoking should be banned in all public places. Importantly, this topic is not smoking should be banned. Therefore, this topic is not about banning smoking in general. It is instead about banning it in public, such as in parks, offices, restaurants, and schools. Therefore, it focuses more on non-smokers than smokers. Firstly, let's look at an example of an analogy. There are many possible ways to begin your analogy, but I have written 2 suggestions for you. These are, Let me use an analogy to better illustrate my point. Or, let me use an analogy to better explain why. I'll now read an example of an analogy. Let me use an analogy to better explain why. In Singapore, chewing gum cannot be used in public, and in Malaysia and even Shanghai Disneyland, the fruit durian is banned. In all three cases, this rule was made to avoid the damaging effects these products have, not on the users themselves, but on the people around them. I believe these examples are exactly the same as smoking in public, which evidence clearly shows can increase the risk of serious health issues. Next, here are two examples of an anecdote. Again, here are some suggestions of how to begin your anecdote. For instance, let me give an example. My two examples are, for example, whenever I go to a restaurant and there are people smoking near me, I feel that I am breathing their smoke. This makes me a smoker, even though I don't want to be. And, let me give an example. Jackie Chan used to spend a lot of time with smokers when making movies, and he said he found it very difficult to breathe and often felt ill. Remember that you cannot use common sense in argumentative essays. However, I have included two examples here to show you what a common sense piece of evidence looks like, so that you will avoid using evidence like this by mistake. Usually, common sense evidence begins with, everyone knows that, it's common knowledge that, it's obvious that, it is universally understood that. Here are two examples. Everyone knows that secondhand smoke is very unhealthy for non-smokers. It's common knowledge that secondhand smoke increases your risk of cancer. The problem with this type of evidence is that your argument is not obvious only because you tell the reader that it is obvious. Instead, you must convince the reader with good quality evidence. For the next type of evidence, you can use any event or phenomenon that your reader will be familiar with, either current or historical, or local, national, or international. Your topic and argument will determine what event is the most relevant. For this topic, I have chosen an international event from recent history. I will read it now. By the way, you can start this type of evidence with phrases like, "There is a similar situation which I believe is particularly relevant here," and "Similar situations can support my point." There is a similar situation here which I believe is particularly relevant. Several countries have already enacted smoking bans in several places, such as the UK. Since the ban in the UK, the number of smoking-related illnesses, such as cancer, strokes, and heart disease, have significantly decreased in both smokers and, more importantly, non-smokers. Here are two examples for the type of evidence which calls upon the opinion of experts. It could begin with, according to quote. The book or website or article, and the name of it, says. I will now read the examples. According to the Environmental Protection Agency, secondhand smoke causes approximately 3,000 lung cancer deaths in non-smokers each year. And, to quote Dr. Wang, who treats lung cancer caused by smoking, there is a huge risk to non-smokers from accidentally breathing in other people's smoke. Making it illegal to smoke in public will improve the public's health. Finally, here are two examples of statistics. In the first, the numbers are whole numbers, and in the second example, they are percentages. I'll now read them. But firstly, you can begin this type of evidence with phrases like, a recent study by, the source, shows that, and according to a survey by the year and the source. For example, a recent study by the Chinese Ministry of Health shows that secondhand smoke causes about 250,000 breathing infections in children every year, which leads to about 15,000 hospitalizations each year. And according to a survey by China Daily in 2018, smokers are 50% more likely to get cancer than non-smokers. This isn't unusual, but second-hand smokers, who don't smoke at all, are 30% more likely to get cancer. In order to be as persuasive as possible, it is important to use emotional examples, which will make the reader feel guilt, sadness, regret, and so on. In the first example, the writer did not just choose to talk about infections in people, but only infections in children. On the topic of secondhand smoke, this is very emotive, because children, especially young children, usually do not have a choice about where they are. If their parents take them to a restaurant and there are smokers at the table next to them, the children won't tell their parents that they need to leave, so they must sit there and breathe in the dangerous air. Even worse, because they are only children, they probably don't know that it is harmful. So you can see that you must think carefully about how to be as persuasive as possible, and using examples which cause the reader to feel emotional is a great way to do this. I cannot easily think of how to use a theory, model, or principle to support the topic about smoking in public places, so let's use a different topic. Let's say that the government in your country were thinking about changing the law to allow children to take 1 week off school every year so that their family can take a holiday during the off-peak season. The government want to do this because low-income families cannot afford to take a holiday during the more expensive holiday season, when the schools are closed. If you wanted to create an argument on this topic, you might claim that low-income families can only afford to go on holiday during the off-peak season because holiday prices are lower during the school semester. But the point is, how do you know that this claim is correct? You need something external to support your claim. Without it, this is a perfect example of conjecture. We will learn about conjecture soon. But basically, conjecture is a claim that lacks evidence to support it. Conjecture usually comes in the form of common sense, especially if the claim begins with, "Everyone knows that," or "It's common knowledge that." Of course, not everything needs to be supported by statistics from a scientific study. Instead, it is acceptable to use principles, models, and theories as support for an unsupported claim. So, here is a claim with conjecture, because it uses common sense to support the argument. Children should be allowed to take 1 week off for a family holiday during the school semester each year, because low-income families can only afford to go on holiday during the off-peak season. This is because, as everyone knows, holiday prices are lower during the school semester. Specifically, the claim is holiday prices are lower during the school semester. We could use the results of a scientific study to support the claim. Children should be allowed to take 1 week off for a family holiday during the school semester each year, because low-income families can only afford to go on holiday during the off-peak season. This is because, according to a survey conducted by the Ministry of Tourism in 2019, holiday prices are lower during the school semester. However, a theory, model, or principle is also acceptable and interesting. Remember, the claim is holiday prices are lower during the school semester. The issues here are the price and the date of holidays. Specifically, holiday prices are lower when fewer people take holidays, and holiday prices are higher when more people take holidays. Which of the theories that we learned about in this episode could explain and support this? Please pause the video and find the most appropriate theory. The best theory is one of the economic ones, supply and demand. In my opinion, this theory can adequately support the claim. My question for you is, can you tell us why supply and demand appropriately supports the claim that holiday prices are lower during the school semester? Please pause the video and decide why this theory can support the claim. Remember that, if the supply of something is the same, but the demand for it is lower, the price will decrease. And if the demand is higher, the price will increase. So, holiday prices are lower when fewer people take holidays, and holiday prices are higher when more people take holidays. Holiday companies make their holidays more expensive when more people want holidays because of their endless quest for profit. We can use this theory to support the unsupported claim by briefly inserting the name of the theory and a brief explanation into the claim, like this. Children should be allowed to take 1 week off for a family holiday during the school semester each year because low-income families can only afford to go on holiday during the off-peak season. This is because, as the economic theory of supply and demand states, holiday prices will be lower during the school semester because fewer people take holidays during this time. It's really that simple. With the insertion of the name of a theory, model, or principle, and a quick explanation, an unsupported claim has been supported. In the previous discussion, we saw a topic sentence that was supported with common sense. To remind you, the topic sentence was, children should be allowed to take 1 week off for a family holiday during the school semester each year because low-income families can only afford to go on holiday during the off-peak season. The support for this was a piece of common sense, which was, this is because, as everyone knows, holiday prices are lower during the school semester. Common sense is a claim that the writer states is not only true, but obviously true. We saw some examples of this for the smoking in public places topic earlier in this episode. The result of the use of common sense as support for the topic sentence is that the entire argument becomes a piece of conjecture. Conjecture is an opinion that lacks valid evidence. Instead, the writer assumes that the opinion is true, because the writer assumes that the reader already agrees with the opinion. So, in an argument with conjecture, the writer makes a claim, but has no evidence to prove it. Therefore, instead of using external, objective evidence to convince the reader that the arguments are valid, the writer relies on his or her own reasoning and his or her own explanation about what he or she assumes to be true. Therefore, the writer makes the claim because he or she assumes it is true, but does not present evidence to prove that it is true. This is a catastrophic weakness that will guarantee a low grade. The problem with using common sense to support an argument is that it is very unconvincing and even a little lazy for the writer to assume that he or she is correct simply because the claim seems obvious. Even if something seems true, you cannot assume that it is true. In other words, even though we probably all agree that holiday prices are lower during the school semester, without any external evidence to support that claim, the writer cannot objectively make that claim. And the overall problem with conjecture is that you cannot assume that the reader knows and agrees with your common sense. Because of this, phrases like "everybody knows that" and "it is universally understood" are absolutely inappropriate in an argumentative essay, because you cannot simply claim that your beliefs are obvious and known by everyone and hope that the reader agrees with you. Instead, every claim you make must be supported by something outside of your own beliefs. And by that, I mean you must have objective, external support for every claim that you make. Therefore, the ultimate goal of an argumentative essay is to convince the reader that your viewpoint is valid by using high-quality reasons, and support those reasons with high-quality evidence. Remember that there are 4 options for valid evidence: statistics from a high-quality source like a university, newspaper, or organization; expert opinions; events and phenomena; or theories, models, and principles. An essay that uses common sense to support its arguments, resulting in conjecture, will get a very low grade. It is best to assume that the reader holds the opposite viewpoint to you, and so you must work extra hard to prove to him or her that you are correct. If you keep this in mind, you won't make any arrogant assumptions about the reader agreeing with your unsupported viewpoint. In conclusion, to be clear, you cannot use this type of evidence in an argument for an argumentative essay. If you can only think of a common sense claim to support your argument, then it is easy to turn your common sense claim into a piece of external evidence by making up a quote or a statistic. We saw this in the previous discussion. For example, a claim with common sense, such as "this is because, as everyone knows, holiday prices are lower during the school semester," can become "this is because, according to a survey conducted by the Ministry of Tourism in 2019, holiday prices are lower during the school semester." This is a simple fix, but it is very effective. The final thing I want to say about evidence is what to do if you cannot find a high-quality piece of evidence to support your reason. In this situation, if you are in an English exam with no access to the internet, it is perfectly acceptable to invent a fictional study by a university, newspaper, or an organization, and therefore invent your own statistics, quotes, anecdotes, and expert opinions. This is because the exam is not testing your ability to research accurate information, it is testing your ability to use argumentative skills. However, importantly, you must not invent evidence for other homework or assignments, because those assignments do test your ability to research accurate information. Of course, you must make your evidence realistic and believable in order to be persuasive. According to research, is not specific, interesting, nor convincing. Instead, you absolutely can use sentences like, according to an article published in the BBC in August 2019. This is supported by a statement from the WHO in January 2020. According to a 2019 study by Cambridge University. According to a survey by China Daily in 2019. According to a report by the World Health Organization in 2019. Remember, if you invent your own evidence, then it must be specific. We've come to the end of our discussion of the body section of an argumentative essay. Now, it is time to explore the final section, the conclusion. This contains 2 parts, the thesis echo and the so what statement. The conclusion has 2 parts. Firstly, a summary, and secondly, a final comment. To create your summary in the first sentence of the conclusion, which is called the thesis echo, you should repeat your thesis statement. However, the thesis echo must not be an exact copy. In other words, it must not repeat your thesis statement word for word. Therefore, you should change the words, but make sure the meaning is similar to your thesis statement. This is why it is called a thesis echo, because it is not an exact copy, just like an echo is not exactly the same as the original sound. In fact, you may have seen the thesis echo called the thesis restatement, but I don't like this name because it sounds like a repetition of the thesis statement. In order to turn your thesis statement into your thesis echo, I recommend that you either do one of two things, or do both of them together. The first thing is to identify the most important parts of the thesis statement, and then move them to different parts of the sentence in your thesis echo. You will need to change the grammar of the sentence. Secondly, you can alter the grammatical category of the important words in the sentence. Thirdly, you could do both of these. Let's look at an example. Our topic for this example is students face many challenges when they do academic research. I have identified that there are three important parts: students, challenges, academic research. I have written 4 thesis echoes. I'll read them now. Most students find that academic research is a challenging task. Many students encounter major difficulties during their academic work. Most students agree that the greatest academic challenge is research. Academic research presents students with challenges. In the first, I swapped the second and third important part and slightly altered the words, so challenges becomes challenging task. In the second and third thesis echo, I did not change the order, but changed the words. So, challenges becomes major difficulties, and academic research becomes academic work, and challenges becomes academic challenge, and academic research becomes research. Finally, in the fourth, the order has completely changed, but the words have stayed the same. So, you can see that there are many options for keeping the meaning similar, but changing the language between the thesis statement and the thesis echo. You should use one of the following phrases to introduce your thesis echo. In conclusion is the most common choice, but there are more unusual and more interesting ones to choose. Here are some examples. To close this off, to finish up, I'd like to conclude now. In closing, if I may conclude. After this, you can say a few words like, I have argued that, it is clear from the above arguments that, or my above analysis demonstrates that. This will lead to your thesis echo. We've now arrived at the final subsection of the conclusion, the so what statement. The so what statement, which appears after the thesis echo at the end of the essay, should offer a final comment or thought on the viewpoint and arguments that you have presented. Many writers omit the so what statement and finish with their summary, but I think this is a wasted opportunity to explain to the reader 3 things. Firstly, why the viewpoint that you have summarized in the thesis echo is significant and important to the reader. Secondly, it explains how your point of view could affect the reader in either a positive or a negative way. And finally, it explains what the reader can learn from your point of view to improve themselves or the world around them. So, how do we write a so what statement? Well, it is usually either a prediction of what might happen in the future, or a recommendation of what should happen in the future. I believe that your essay topic will determine which type of so what statement is more appropriate. So, let's look at both types, with examples and my suggestions. I recommend that you use a prediction so what statement if your essay topic is arguing for something to change, or in other words, is arguing that a change should happen. A prediction so what statement states what might happen in the future, depending on whether the change for which you are arguing happens or not. Because of this, there are two types. If you want your essay to have a more uplifting conclusion, then use a positive prediction, in which you discuss the positive effects of carrying out the change for which you are arguing. On the other hand, your conclusion will be more serious and dooming if you use a negative prediction, where you discuss the negative consequences of not carrying out the change. This type of so what statement can be very effective if your topic is thought-provoking, because a prediction can make your reader think about the future consequences of your point of view. Before we look at some examples, let's look at some topics that are appropriate for a prediction so what statement. Unused mobile phone internet data should be added to the next month's amount. Children should not block their parents from viewing their social media profiles. Sex education is necessary in school. Regional dialects should be protected from extinction. As you can see from all of these topics, they are arguing that a change should happen. Let's now look at some examples. Firstly, here is a positive prediction about what good things will happen in the future if the change does happen. The topic is, reforesting the Amazon rainforest is urgently needed. The thesis echo is in red, and the so what statement is in blue. I'll now read the entire conclusion. To conclude, reforesting the Amazon rainforest will significantly reduce the effects of global warming. If reforesting happens, global warming will be significantly reduced, and countless species of plants and animals will be saved, all of which will have significant long-term environmental and global benefits. Next, here is a negative prediction for the same topic. Reforesting the Amazon rainforest is urgently needed. In my opinion, both positive and negative predictions are effective in different ways, so your topic, and the feeling you want to create at the end of your essay, will determine which type to use. I'll now read the conclusion. To conclude, reforesting the Amazon rainforest will significantly reduce the effects of global warming. Without this, the people of South America will continue to destroy their natural resources for short-term economic benefits, and this will have devastating long-term environmental and global consequences. Here is one more example for the topic, pet dogs should be allowed in more public places. I'll now read the conclusion. If I may conclude, I have argued that dogs which are kept as pets should not be banned from public areas. If pet dogs are allowed in more public places, the social harmony will be improved between dog owners and non-dog owners, because non-dog owners will often see well-behaved dogs in more public places. And overall, this will improve the cohesion between all members of society. The second type of so what statement is a recommendation. Unlike a prediction, which you use if your topic calls for a change to happen, a recommendation should be used if your topic discusses a problem, or simply a situation which exists. There are two types of recommendation. Firstly, it can suggest a solution to the problem. In other words, it states what change should be made to solve the problem. Secondly, it can ask the reader to do something about the problem, perhaps to fix it, or to simply be more aware of the problem. Before we look at some examples, let's look at topics that are appropriate for a recommendation so what statement. Using mobile phones while driving is dangerous. TikTok has a negative influence on people and society. Practice and internships are more important than textbook knowledge for university students. Single boys and girls spending time together should not cause gossip. It is not compulsory for young people to give their seat to elderly people on buses and the metro. As you can see from all of these topics, they are claiming that a problem exists. Let's now look at some examples. Firstly, this so what statement recommends a solution to the problem. The topic is, international students face a number of problems. And the conclusion is, as we have seen, foreign students face several difficulties when studying in a new country. However, preparation before the students come to the new country can reduce problems such as culture shock and the language barrier. If you choose to study in another country, you should learn about its culture, customs, and history. Also, you should be proficient in the language, or sign up for language classes after you arrive. You can see that in the so what statement, the writer is talking directly to the reader, who could be an international student, and giving him or her specific advice to solve the problems discussed in the essay. Here is the other type of recommendation. If you are a local student who encounters a foreign student, please do your best to help him or her learn about your culture, customs, and history. This will give him or her the best opportunity to make the most of living in your country. You can see that the writer is still talking to the reader of the essay, but is now assuming that the reader is a local student, not an international student, who are the people involved in the topic. Therefore, the writer recommends that he or she makes some changes that will help to solve the problem discussed in the essay. Here is a final example for the topic, enjoying the air conditioning in metro stations should be banned. Here is the conclusion. I'd like to conclude now by reiterating that it should not be allowed to enter metro stations only to escape the hot weather. To achieve this, I recommend that the payment gates be moved to the station entrances. Also, perhaps the government should create a building with air conditioning in public parks. Together, these will make everyone's life more convenient. You can see that the writer is not asking the reader to do anything, but is simply stating what changes he or she believes should happen. Therefore, this is suggesting a solution to the problem. Here is an activity about so what statements. For the following topic, listen to the arguments. Then, you need to create a so what statement. I recommend that you firstly decide whether to choose a positive or negative prediction or a recommendation. Afterwards, think of the so what statement. Pause the video after I read the topic and arguments, and continue after you have thought of a so what statement. Plastic straws should be banned worldwide. Plastic straws cannot be recycled and take many years to decompose. If we bury the plastic straws, eventually the whole world will be buried with plastic. If we try to burn them, this will cause air pollution. If the air is polluted, people will breathe in the polluted air, which will cause many illnesses. Plastic straws often get into the sea, which can harm or even kill marine organisms. Pause the video now to think of an appropriate so what statement. Here is the writer's so what statement. If all countries do not replace plastic straws with paper straws, which are much better for the environment, it is clear that untold and irreversible damage will continue to be inflicted upon our world. For this topic, the writer chose to write a negative prediction. In it, he or she predicted the negative consequences of not putting into action the change that he or she argued for in the essay. This is the end of the video about writing an argumentative essay. If you liked what you heard, then you can find more videos in my writing skills series, as well as other series on the topics of English and linguistics. Thank you for watching.